Gaius Julius Caesar, Praetor 92 BCE. The scion of a patrician gens returning to prominence after centuries on the political margins, Gaius Julius Caesar was one of 4 men in his family who came of age with viable consular ambitions. However, the bulk of his career saw him overshadowed by his brother-in-law, the incomparable new man, Gaius Marius. Marius's meteoric rise aided the Julian family immensely, and even after the old man's fall from grace in 100, the 4 men named Julius Caesar continued their march to the pinnacle of power. Perhaps the least ambitious, or simply the most cautious of the 4, Gaius Caesar avoided controversies successfully as he climbed the ranks of the cursus honorum. Arranging for his 2 daughters and 1 son to marry wealthy equestrians, he seems to have understood that money was increasingly the most important factor for determining political success in Rome. Upon his return to Rome after a stint as governor in Asia, the elder Caesar found that he had missed the moment when a united Julian family had dominated the key commands of the Republic during the Social War, and now the direction of that conflict passed to newcomers such as Sulla and Pompeius Strabo. Caesar either outright backed Marius' seizure of Sulla's eastern command in 88, or at least was willing to countenance it. When Cinna and Marius took over, Caesar became the last adult male representative of his gens in the Senate, as his cousins were killed brutally for backing Sulla the previous year. Staying on good terms with his brother-in-law, Caesar was able to secure the hand of Cinna's daughter for his son, although we can only guess at how he might have felt about his only son becoming the Flamen Dialis, as per Marius' wishes. Once the old man passed away in 86, Caesar found himself with a bit more standing, as he was an adult male of consular age with strong ties to the now-deceased legend. When the army sent east to confront and replace Sulla mutinied, Caesar was the man chosen by Cinna and Carbo to raise a new army. Here, at long last, was his chance to sign his name in history's guest book. It was not to be. Either at home or in Pisa, Caesar died suddenly while donning his shoes one morning. In this examination of Caesar's life, I will push back against the almost universal notion that the dictator's father lacked ambition, and I will instead present him as deliberate and calculating, much like his far more famous son, but with less theatricality and flair. Although the scions of gens Julia could not claim to have had the most political success in the history of the Republic, they did take a certain amount of pride in being older than, and maybe therefore greater than, the Republic itself. The claim that they made is that they were direct descendants of Aeneas, who was himself the son of Venus. This gave them the most direct line of descent back to Troy. And they also claimed that their ancestors were among the chief citizens of Alba Longa, and then they had migrated from there to Rome. So gens Julia would claim not only to be older than the Republic, but even older than the Roman monarchy, which at this point was itself almost semi-legendary. So the family had immense antiquity, even if their current stature did not quite live up to the claims that they made when it came to their family history. As for the various branches of gens Julia, the Caesar branch was relatively new. The most famous branch during the early and middle Republic was the Ullius branch, and that had really peaked about in the 4th century and then fallen off pretty rapidly after that point. There also had been 2 other branches to produce consuls, the Mento branch, which was in 431, and then the Libo branch around 267. But aside from that, the family had been quiet for some time. The Middle Republic had not been a thriving period for men named Julius. That started to turn around slowly but surely with Sextus Julius Caesar, who served as praetor in 208. After that, there were multiple Caesars in the Senate, and by the time of our Gaius Julius Caesar, there were 2 families bearing the name Julius Caesar, one of which was about a second cousin to his own family. There was another man in the family to become consul after Sextus's run as praetor, so at this point they had been reestablished as consular contenders. The grandfather of our Caesar, and therefore the great-grandfather of the famous dictator, was probably a man named Gaius Julius, who wrote a history of Rome in Greek during the 140s. The writing of histories in Greek by Roman senators had become fairly common by this time, and so that's partly why we know so little about this work or the author's full name. As for the parents of our Caesar, it would be another man named Gaius Julius Caesar. So potentially we're talking about 4 Gaius Julius Caesars being relevant in this video. And I guess that makes things even more confusing, but let's stay focused. The mother of our Caesar was named Marcia. She also came from a noble family. And the Caesar we're studying was born around 135, although it's possible he might have been born as late as 131. He also had a brother named Sextus, and most likely Sextus was a little bit older because he will be consul 1 year after our Caesar becomes praetor. So in all likelihood, there was a 2-year age gap, and Sextus was born first. So Sextus we can date to about 137 to 133. The birth of Gaius would be 135 to 131, somewhere in that range. And the dates are pretty debatable. As we'll see, we do have some source problems when it comes to Caesar the father. There was never a bad time to be born as a patrician in Rome, but for Gaius Julius Caesar, he chose a particularly good time to come of age as a Caesar. The late Republic saw a lot of old patrician families make comebacks, and in fact the Julian family started their comeback earlier and with a lot more force than most. In fact, he would be a part of a cohort of 4 men named Julius Caesar who would come of age together and try to conquer Roman politics. So far as we can tell, these 4 men were close throughout their lives, even though there will be some tension by the time that we get to the Social War era. But growing up, it seems like they were on good terms, and those good feelings would be restored after the turmoil of the 80s, as we see from the life of the more famous Caesar the dictator, who is on very good terms with all of his cousins throughout his life. As for Gaius's brother Sextus, he was most likely 2 years older, or simply was a bit more aggressive and ambitious, and leapfrogged his elder brother to become consul in 91. So he would reach the pinnacle. Gaius himself would be pretty well set up to do anything in Roman politics, and also to pass on a very prestigious lineage to his own son, because his wife was Aurelia, the daughter of the consul 119 Lucius Aurelius Cotta. There's a pretty good chance that by the time that Caesar married Aurelia, that her father was already dead, or at least pretty close to it. As for his brothers-in-law, all of them would eventually rise to the consulship between 75 and 65. So they were a fair amount younger than he was, and still they would prove ultimately to be pretty strong allies for his son, the future Gaius Julius Caesar. He also had 2 cousins, one of whom was Lucius Julius Caesar, who became consul in 90 and was the father of the consul of 65. Lucius had a younger brother, Gaius Julius Caesar Strabo, who was a bit younger than the rest, maybe 5 or so years younger than the other 3 Caesars of this generation, who was renowned for being a witty orator and playwright, and he actually held the office of aedile the same year that his older brother was consul. So, just within the family, they had a pretty strong coalition of powerful senators. And yet, none of these guys was the most prominent member of their political clique. And the guy who would overshadow them all was actually not even a patrician, much less a Caesar, much less a descendant of Venus. Gaius and Sextus had a sister, who after the fashion of the Romans was named simply Julia for her family's name, and she happened to be married off to a rising plebeian politician. This was someone who was pretty unlikely to ever achieve the absolute summit of Roman politics, but he was a man of ability and someone who had gained some popularity. So he was not necessarily a bad ally to recruit. Needless to say, he would vastly overperform what the Julians expected of him. That man was Gaius Marius, who would become one of the truly monumental figures in Roman history. Marius not only would achieve the consulship, which was rare enough for a new man, but he would do so in a fashion that was completely unprecedented. His first consulship was not necessarily that far out of the box. He managed to outmaneuver his aristocratic patron to steal his command against Jugurtha, but then he became so popular with the common people that he was able to present himself as the only potential savior from annihilation at the hands of the Cimbrian Teutones, and that enabled him to win 5 consecutive back-to-back consulships, something that had never even been imagined before, much less achieved. And this probably was something that might have even alarmed the Caesars, because they themselves were the inheritors and beneficiaries of the Republic, which was regulated by the fact that power was shared among the nobility. That being said, for purely selfish reasons, they all benefited from this, because they were very much in league with Marius, and any success that he had would rub off on them. Besides, the 4 rising Caesars were not quite of high office holding age yet. So for them, this was merely a way to get opportunities and gain experience under the tutelage of this unexpected boon that's provided by Marius, defying all expectations and norms. Another thing to keep in mind is that Marius himself, due to this kind of success, would largely become the guy leading the faction. So I imagine when the Caesars engaged him and brought him into the family, they were expecting him to be more of a supporting player, but in fact he took the lead, and he would add other members of old families to this group, including one of his nephews, Publius Rutilius Lupus, who would be consul in 90, and was also a relative of Aurelia. So, in fact, Gaius Julius Caesar was related to Marius twice over, through marriage to his sister, but also to Rutilius, who is then the nephew of Marius in a different direction. So the ties here were pretty strong, and as we'll see, Caesar will actually show quite a bit of loyalty to Marius, and that, of course, will famously be extremely beneficial to his son when he starts to stake out his own position in politics in the 70s. Despite the fact that we're talking about the father of perhaps the most famous man in Roman history, we actually don't know that much about Gaius Julius Caesar, the Praetor of 92. In fact, I call him the Praetor of 92 because the scholarly consensus is that that was the year he held that office. But in fact, we don't know that for certain. What we do know are the offices he held, just not exactly when he held them. We know, for instance, that he was a commissioner for a colony that was founded at Circina. This was almost certainly a Saturninus initiative. Saturninus was a tribune friendly to Marius, and this probably occurred in 103, during Marius's 5 back-to-back consulships, about in the middle of that period. We also know that he served as a military tribune, so he was a subordinate officer to a commander. That's pretty typical. Almost all aspiring high magistrates will do that at least once in their career. He also served as a quaestor, the lowest ranking officer. We know about that office. And it's possible that he served either right when his son was born in the year 100, or that he served a year or two later. So sometime between 100 and 98, he would have been quaestor. And then for his praetorship, the most commonly ascribed date is 92. We know that right after he left office, he then went to be the pro-praetorian governor of Asia. And most likely he stayed for at least 1 year, 91, and he might have actually stayed until the end of 90. So what we can say for certain, though, is that he was not there in 89 when the First Mithridatic War broke out, because we actually know who was governor then, and that was Lucius Cassius. So we have some idea of where he was, and certainly his governorship expired at the latest by the end of 90. This also means, of course, that he missed out on the absolute fiasco that was the First Mithridatic War, which was just simply good luck. But at the same time, he had some rough luck insofar as he was a high-ranking official with a lot of experience, or at least a decent amount of experience, combined with relative youth, at a time when the entire Republic was at war with their Italian allies, and all of his other relatives were engaged in that war, but he was too far away to participate. And we'll come back to that in a minute when we look at just how stacked the family's fortunes were in the year 90. But in the meantime, let's focus more on what we do know about Gaius Julius Caesar and his particular rise to some form of political prominence. In 92, Gaius Julius Caesar was one of the 6 praetors. The choice assignment would be to head the Roman courts, and that assignment typically went to the person who got the most votes. But the second most prestigious assignment, which fell to Caesar, was to be praetor peregrinus, which is to say that he headed the courts which handled disputes between Roman citizens on the one hand and non-citizens. So the other court would be the one that would handle all the really high-profile controversial cases between senators, which meant that the person heading the court not only got a lot of exposure, but potentially could get himself in a lot of trouble. Typically speaking, the praetor peregrinus would get some exposure without all that much danger, since all he had to do to court voters was to side with Romans over non-Romans. That being said, Caesar would hold this office right before the Social War, which means that he could not possibly have missed out on the fact that the tension was mounting, and that the Italians were increasingly discontent. That being said, we don't have any known instances from his time as praetor. We don't know any of the court cases that were brought before him, how he performed on the job, or whether he decided that Rome should do something about the issue, or whether he was one of the majority of Roman senators who thought that it was best simply to ban Italians from Rome and just ignore the problem and hope that it would go away. Most likely he was in that majority because, well, most of these guys were. And to us today that seems incredibly irresponsible, but that was the consensus opinion at the time. And not only that, but it actually was the popular opinion among the people who didn't want to dilute their political influence by sharing citizenship with more people. And given that Caesar seems to have been a rather cautious politician, my guess is that he did not state very strong opinions one way or another, and that he tried his best to appear impartial as a judge, even though he would do the politically expedient thing in the end and mostly side with Roman citizens over non-citizens. There's a good chance that Caesar was disappointed that he didn't get the top spot as praetor, but once he found out what the major case that year was going to be in the Roman court, one has to imagine that he breathed a big sigh of relief that he didn't have to preside over such a case, because the case that would consume all the oxygen in the air in Rome in 92 was one which involved a lot of people who were very closely aligned with his wife's family. On the one hand, a young man named Caepio would be the prosecutor, and he was the best friend of one of Aurelio's brothers, no doubt somebody that Caesar himself would be pretty well acquainted with by this point. And he was going after a well-known figure in Rome, Publius Rutilius Rufus, another man who was actually related to Aurelia, and was an ex-consul from 105, someone who had been one of the many colleagues of Gaius Marius over the years. The case was for the alleged corruption that Rutilius had engaged in when he went as a commissioner to Asia under the direction of the current Pontifex Maximus, Quintus Mucius Scaevola. And the accusation was that he had enabled corruption. Most people, even at the time, and especially since, have agreed, however, that actually what Scaevola and Rutilius Rufus did was to try to fight corruption, and that this case several years later, at least probably 10 years later, was actually a revenge by the tax collectors who had lost money because their practices had been temporarily halted. There's also a rumor going around Rome at the time that Caesar's brother-in-law and most important political ally, even though his prestige had fallen a bit after 100, Gaius Marius, was also secretly involved in this case, and that he was privately encouraging Caepio. Also, that he had encouraged Caepio to go after Rutilius Rufus and not go after the primary person responsible for that commission, Scaevola. And the reason for that is that Marius had arranged for his son, Gaius Marius the Younger, to engage with Scaevola's youngest daughter, Mucia Tertia. So there were a lot of moving parts, and no matter what the elder Caesar might have done, he would have stepped in shit. And so Arthur Kahn, among others, believes that Caesar decided to not step into this controversy, and that while he might have been able to stick around Rome a bit longer, he knew that doing so would cause him to have to take a stand on this case, so he most likely left Rome a little early to avoid being involved in this family drama. And honestly, in this case, given how things were playing out, it's hard to find much fault with Caesar if indeed he did skip town to avoid getting involved in this, because this promised to be absolutely messy. We also don't know for sure whether he tried to play both sides, but my guess would be that he most likely did a little bit of that. Interestingly enough, Caesar would go to a province that was at the heart of the trial he was trying so hard to stay the hell out of. Romanasia was without a doubt the best prize at the time when it came to provinces a Roman governor might pull. There was always a chance of warfare, and even when there wasn't a war to fight, there was a lot of tax to be collected and a lot of fat to skim off the top. So for Caesar, who seems to have been very financially savvy and also to have looked to enhance his family's financial standing, this was a perfect opportunity. Unlike politicians with more scruples, he also was very much willing to play ball when it came to playing along with the corruption in the Roman system and milking it to his advantage. We also see that he will do everything in his power to try to make sure that his family will benefit from the equestrian business practices in the East. Of his 3 children, he will make sure that his eldest daughter, Julia Major, will marry a wealthy equestrian named Pedius, who was, I believe, engaged with this Eastern trade. As for his son and namesake, the future dictator, he actually has him initially engaged to a woman named Cosudia, whose family was really deeply involved in trade in Romanasia. It was only his younger daughter, Julia Minor, who was actually engaged to a politician who we'll meet in a little bit. So Caesar is clearly thinking of setting his family up for wealth, because I guess they already have a fairly perfect pedigree, so wealth is really the thing they need to focus on now. We also know that he apparently was rather pleasing to the local elites of this area. The Greeks who ran Delos actually put up an inscription to honor his work as governor. And so he apparently did a good job by the standards of the elite who actually ran this area. That means most likely he allowed corruption but didn't allow it to be abusive or completely out of hand. So he struck a balance. One also has to wonder how much interaction he had with the recently exiled Rutilius Rufus, who actually settled down in Smyrna, where he was actually respected by the locals because he wasn't corrupt. So there's a good chance that Caesar, being the politician he was, stopped by Smyrna and played buddy-buddy and consoled this guy in order to make sure the locals thought of him as a good guy as well. We don't know, though, but that's just my suspicion. And perhaps if he was feeling charitable, he might have used his office as governor to try to make sure that his fellow Roman and ex-consul was settled in well and taken care of. We know for a fact that Rutilius Rufus was well regarded in this area because when the pogrom by Mithridates starts, the locals will actually go to a lot of trouble to make sure that Rutilius Rufus dodges the executioner's blade. As for whether Caesar would have done so, it's pretty unlikely, honestly. Gaius Julius Caesar was endearing himself to the elite in the East and also lining his pockets pretty well, and at the same time, his brother and two cousins will be busy dealing with the social war. His brother Sextus was elected consul in the year 91. It had mostly been peaceful, although there were rumblings about Italian discontent, but the majority of the Senate thought that this would blow over. And then it turned out that was a false hope. Even after a failed assassination attempt against Sextus and his colleague went off, the Roman Senate thought that if they merely banned Italians from the city of Rome, that the tension would allay and things would go back to normal. They also, many of them, blamed Livius Drusus the Younger, the guy proposing giving citizenship to the Italians, for promoting this kind of dissent. However, when Livius Drusus the Younger was assassinated, all hell broke loose, and revolts broke out all up and down the Italian peninsula. Going into the social war at the end of 91, the Romans didn't have time to respond to these revolts and had to wait until the beginning of 90 before armies could take the field and begin fighting. And I just want to make it clear exactly how dominant men named Julius Caesar and their immediate allies and family members were in the Roman war effort of the year 90. So the previous year's consul, Sextus Julius Caesar, brother of our Gaius Julius Caesar, is prorogued and made proconsul. So he gets an army, and there will be 3 consular armies deployed. Of the other 2 armies, one is led by Caesar's cousin, Lucius Julius Caesar, who just got elected as the patrician consul, and his colleague will be Publius Rutilius Lupus. And his name is not immediately familiar, but remember, the Rutilii are relatives of Aurelia, Gaius Julius Caesar's wife, and also because of that connection that she had, that Rutilius has to a number of people in Rome, including the Caesars, he's also related in another connection because his uncle is Gaius Marius, the legendary general, who will now come out of retirement to be a senior legate. As for Lucius Julius Caesar, his army will have as senior legate Sulla, and that will actually draw away Lucius and his younger brother Caesar Strabo, who will start to back Sulla more than Marius because they become enamored with Sulla's command abilities when Sulla is a legate with Lucius. As far as Sextus's army, it will actually probably do better than the other 2 armies in the year 90, at least at first, and at least under the main commander. So arguably the army of Rutilius Lupus will do the best work, but most of that will be after he dies and Marius is forced to take command. Sextus will actually win a whole battle, but then he'll die in the process of his campaign due to camp illness, and his army will pass to his chief legate, Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo. That being said, that's not necessarily a disaster for the Julians, because it turns out that Pompeius Strabo has a nephew who is engaged or married already to the youngest daughter of Gaius Julius Caesar, Julia Minor. So, with the exception of Sulla, every other major figure in the Roman armies in the year 90 who mattered militarily was a friend or relative of Gaius Julius Caesar. So over the years, I've often thought that the way Rome Total War portrayed Roman politics was kind of faintly ridiculous, the idea of a Julii faction. But if we're just talking about the year 90, I'd have to say that Rome Total War is a documentary account of how Roman politics worked, at least in this one instance. When we think of the dictator Gaius Julius Caesar, we often think of the low ebb of his fortunes at the beginning of his life, how his family had somewhat fallen, and we forget that when he was about 10 years old, he could look at the commanding officers of the state and see that just about every single one of them was a close family member or family friend. So when we think about the kind of confidence that Caesar the dictator had throughout his career, we have to think back and remember he saw this vision almost come to pass already. So for him, perhaps this was a source of inspiration. But in the meantime, let's go back to his father, the Praetor of 92. What he had to deal with at this moment is that although his family had acquired a ton of power in the year 90, that fell apart pretty quickly, and he was left holding the bag. So his brother Sextus was on his path to being a war hero, and perhaps if he had lived, he might have become the great hero of the social war. He was the first to win a major battle. He killed 8,000 Italians, and his army was doing well, but then he died of an illness in camp, as we mentioned earlier. So he never got to really reap the reward for all of his hard work. And that left his army in the hands of Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo, the father of the famous Pompey the Great. And Pompeius Strabo, while he was not popular with the Senate, and apparently was not a particularly charming or attractive man, still was a good general, and would gain a lot of recognition for that in Rome. This would help him become consul in 89. As far as relations among the Caesars, this war also seems to have caused problems. Arthur Kahn thinks that they divided before the conflict began because the cousins, Lucius and Caesar Strabo, had been against Drusus, whereas Gaius and Marius had been more favorable to Drusus. But that's pretty speculative. It's also simply possible, as I sort of suspect, that Lucius was grateful that Sulla had run his army for him and brought about some victory and prevented him from embarrassing himself too badly. And so the family will divide, though, over the Marius versus Sulla issue. We have to remember that our Caesar and the recently departed Sextus were far more beholden to Marius than their cousins, Lucius and Caesar Strabo. And so perhaps Lucius and Strabo were more outraged by Marius's conduct, doing all the old man workouts in the Forum, and then stealing Sulla's command. And their backing of Sulla, when he marched on Rome in 88, earned them the undying enmity of Marius and Cinna. So the following year, among the slain in Rome were Lucius and Caesar Strabo. As for our guy, Gaius Julius Caesar the Elder, he's now the last remaining member of his family who is an adult and sitting member of the Senate, which gives him a certain amount of prestige, but it must have been lonely and somewhat sad. That being said, he had plenty of things to keep him busy, not least of which was overseeing the education of his son and namesake, the future dictator. Modern biographies like to look at a person's childhood and study it in great detail. Ancient biographies, however, barely touch on childhood, and when they do, they only look for interesting anecdotes that might seem to prefigure what they do in their adult years. Unfortunately for us, the one biographer who often does talk about family history, Suetonius, the section of his life of Caesar that deals with that is missing. And the only thing we have from him about Caesar the Elder, the subject of this video, is that he died when his son was young. So accordingly, we know very, very little about the relationship between the two men. That hasn't stopped a lot of people from speculating about what their relationship must have been like based on the norms of the day. So there's a whole book called The Education of Julius Caesar, where Arthur Kahn spends the first several chapters talking about how Aurelia and Caesar raised their son. But a lot of that is based on what we know about Roman norms at the time, and not on any specific information. In fact, the only specific detail we have about Caesar's raising of his son is that he hired for him a well-regarded tutor, the freedman Marcus Antonius Nepho, who was born in Gaul and then educated by, most likely, Marcus Antonius, the famous consul and orator, and then Caesar the Elder used his political connections to get in contact and hire Nepho as a tutor. And apparently Nepho first became a well-known tutor because of his work with young Caesar. And of course, young Caesar would go on to be a great orator and a pretty accomplished intellectual in his own right, so this made Nepho pretty famous and sought after. And this is even before Caesar became the monumental Caesar, just when he was a rising star in politics. So, if anything, Caesar the Elder made this man, Nepho, into a very prosperous tutor. But most of the education usually fell on the mom, especially for the first 7 years or so of life, and even then, we know that Aurelia was around until the year 54, so she was there when her son became consul, and for all the steps along the way, and also when he left for Gaul. So she was the one who actually shared the political journey with the future dictator more so than his father. So we can only really speculate about what Caesar might have learned from his dad. My guess is that there are two potential things. One is that you have to be calculating, and Caesar was often accused of being cold and calculating. The other is that it had become something of a tradition due to the writings of Cato the Elder on parenthood to teach your son to swim in person. So he had gone swimming with his son in the Tiber River. So if I had to guess about one activity that Caesar might have taken time to do with his son, I would guess that he swam with him quite a bit in the Tiber. And the reason why I think that is that we know that the future dictator, even well in the Middle Age, was a vigorous swimmer. He actually swam away from an enemy fleet at one point in Alexandria during the time he was hanging out with Cleopatra. So that would be my guess as to the time that they spent together as father and son. But again, we'll never know, and we just don't have the evidence to say a whole lot. But a whole lot of ink has been spilled on this, believe it or not, despite the lack of evidence. When we think about Gaius Julius Caesar the Elder's career, perhaps the biggest blank of all is what he was up to once the Marians came back to power in 87. Because we only know what happens to him and what happens to his son. We don't really know exactly what they were angling for. We can only guess. And because Marius was now in complete charge of the state, it's easy to ascribe all of the agency to him. But that being said, Marius, by this point, was losing his marbles, frankly. So a lot of this arrangement might have been more the work of Cinna. But we have to remember, Caesar, the father that is, was still in his prime years or not far removed from it, and so he was most likely involved in this process in some way. What were his thoughts? Well, we don't know. There's a good chance that he was completely disgusted and horrified by the slaughter of his cousins. So maybe he wasn't on speaking terms with Marius for a bit. And maybe that's why he didn't press more vigorously to get high office. We don't know. A lot of scholars have assumed that he was a quiet and retreating man and that he simply retired. But that seems to be, I think, an underestimate of his ambition. He was not a loud or assertive man, but to say he lacks ambition is perhaps going too far. One thing that Marius arranges for Caesar's son is that he wants him to be the next Flamen Dialis, which is a very prestigious priesthood of Jupiter. And while it is extremely prestigious and important, the Romans certainly thought their relationship with the gods determined their survival, it did have some restrictions. So the Flamen Dialis was monitored at all times. He always had to be in a group with a bunch of other attendants. He also had a lot of dietary restrictions, and he also was not someone who held political office. So unlike, say, the Pontifex Maximus, who was free to hold any office in the state, the Flamen Dialis was not. It appears that Caesar the Elder agreed to have his son hold this office. As for the younger Caesar's opinion on this, we have no idea, except that he was someone who was an excellent student, and he did spend time studying for the role under the tutelage of Scaevola. However, in exchange for making this kind of sacrifice, one thing that Marius and Cinna offered was to upgrade the future wife of the younger Caesar. So instead of marrying Cosudia, instead he would get married to Cornelia, one of the daughters of Lucius Cornelius Cinna, who was at first equal with Marius and then was the guy running the faction after Marius' death in 86. And so one imagines that when the offer was made, this might have been part of a counteroffer by Caesar the father, that he wanted to make sure that his son was getting something out of this, and perhaps also advancing himself, because if his son would be Flamen Dialis, and he would have his daughter-in-law, the daughter of Cinna, then he himself would be a power player. We also have to remember that once Marius was dead, that while Marius the Younger was around and an adult, he was still very young, and there was no other member of Marius's family, really, who was left standing and of office-holding age. And so this might have been a slow game by the elder Caesar to enhance his position and put himself in a position to rise to leadership within the Marian faction. In fact, I think there's a good case for this, in that he played his cards cautiously, because we look at, in late 85 to 84, news arrived that an army raised by Flaccus to put down Sulla had erupted in mutiny because they didn't want to go fight Sulla. And the guy leading the mutiny was one of the legates, Fimbria, an ostensible ally, although a very much a wild card among the members of the Senate. And when Cinna and Carbo now being sort of the chief lieutenant of the Marian movement, when they were looking for someone reliable to raise a new army and restore order, they chose Caesar. And so Caesar would go on his last assignment to go to Etruria to raise new troops. And it was here when he would slip his mortal coil. It's not entirely clear whether Caesar actually made it to Etruria to raise troops, or whether he had gone back to Rome, or exactly where he was at the time of his death. All we know is that one morning, either at his home in Rome or staying as a guest in Pisa, he was putting on his shoes, and all of a sudden, he dropped dead. He would have been somewhere between 46 and 50 years old at the time of his death. According to Pliny the Elder in his Natural History, an earlier Caesar, who quite possibly could have been his father, had passed away while putting on his shoes at an estate near Pisa. And there's a possibility that there's some confusion here, since Pisa is in Etruria, and we know that Caesar was assigned to raise troops there right before he died. Now, the timing of this was not great for his son. So his death came just a few weeks before his son came of age. And normally, a young Roman male will become a man officially and don the toga of manhood, the toga virilis, at the age of 15, or perhaps 16. So one has to imagine that that ceremony ended up being deeply somber because Caesar had just lost his dad. In one of Stephen Saylor's novels, the famous Caesar will meet often with the main character of the novels, Gordianus the Finder, and especially as he was getting older and more reflective, he would talk about how he was now older than his father was when he died putting on his shoes, and how every time he puts on his shoes in the morning, now he thinks about his dad. We have no idea if Caesar was quite that sentimental. But what we do know is that he was willing to take advantage of sentiment, and so it turns out that although Caesar the Elder is now gone, he will not be forgotten quite yet, because his son is going to make sure that his memory lives on, and he'll do so clad in silver. Caesar was not the last of his generation, as his sister would survive him until the year 69 BCE. When she died, this was a fairly propitious time for his son. So, with Marius' own kids long dead, it fell to the younger Gaius Julius Caesar to deliver his aunt's eulogy. And at this eulogy, he's able to then honor his entire family, including the dead war hero Marius. And at this funeral for Julia, for the first time in years, for the first time since 82, when Sulla had taken over Rome, the images representing and celebrating the legacy of Marius were portrayed. And Caesar more or less had a coming out party, where he was not only a new rising force in Roman politics, he actually was already quaestor by this time, so he was nearly 30, but also he was coming out and saying very clearly that he was the heir to Marius. So perhaps his father had felt overshadowed by Marius, but because of the death of Marius' son, that meant that the younger Caesar could simply take up the mantle, and there was nobody to tell him no. The conservative supporters of Sulla, who had dominated politics for over a decade, protested, but the crowds cheered. And perhaps this is when Caesar, the younger Caesar that is, became truly controversial. A few years later, Caesar was holding the office of aedile, and he once again decided to try to court popularity. One thing people loved were gladiatorial bouts, but unfortunately, there was a rule in place that these could only be held at funerals. Remember, this is quite a while before the building of the Colosseum and the regularization of gladiatorial games. So Caesar, being the savvy individual that he is, when people pointed out that this was not a funeral celebration, he said, "Yes, it is. We're celebrating my father. Granted, he died 20 years ago, but we can celebrate him anyway." So not only did Caesar hold funeral games for his father 20 years after the fact, but he did so in a pretty unique way, with silver-clad fighters. And so, in the eyes of Roman voters, Caesar was able to portray himself as pious by honoring the Praetor of 92 in such magnificent fashion, and spending so much of the money that that man passed on to Caesar in the process. Caesar the dictator was very skilled at self-promotion and a savvy politician. But it was his grandnephew Octavian who was the true god of propaganda. And if we think back to Octavian and his heritage, we recall Octavian is the son of Adia. Adia is the daughter of Julia Minor. Julia Minor's father is Gaius Julius Caesar, the Praetor of 92. So Octavian, who became Augustus, the first emperor, is a great-grandson, directly, of the man we've been studying today. Augustus passed on many of his propaganda-promoting duties to his best friend and son-in-law, Marcus Agrippa, who had a certain flair for architecture and designed the Pantheon, perhaps the most impressive, or at least most famous building in Rome. And the Pantheon celebrates not only the deified Julius, this being the son of the man we've been studying, but contains an entire wing dedicated to the various family members who led up to the great dictator. And among the people who got honored were Gaius Julius Caesar, the great-grandfather of the emperor at the time when the building was constructed, and a cousin of that Caesar, Caesar Strabo, who was the famous orator and playwright. So at one point, before the 7th century, if you were to go in the Pantheon, you could get a full lesson in the history of the Julian family by going into this building dedicated to all the gods. Because remember, Julius Caesar, by this point, the building was dedicated in 2 BCE, was one of those gods. And you can learn about the human relatives, because the Caesar we've been studying today was merely human. Unfortunately, a lot of that got removed from the Pantheon when it was consecrated as a church in the 7th century, and they had to remove many of the old statues and busts on the grounds that they were a little too pagan. And so, most likely, the statues of the various relatives were removed, and that's why we have no image of Caesar's dad, or of Caesar Strabo, or any of the other various relatives who did so much to actually shape the life of the dictator, who himself would go on to shape the destiny of the Roman Republic and the coming of the Roman Empire. The elder Gaius Julius Caesar doesn't jump off the page. We don't know enough about him to make him one of the lively or really compelling figures in Roman history. He doesn't seem to have been outright ambitious in the way that, say, Marius was, or that Sulla was, or that his own son was. He instead was someone who was much more slow and steady in his approach to power and politics. In fact, if anything, I would say that he's actually the least interesting Julius Caesar of his generation. His brother and his 2 cousins were more dynamic figures in many ways. That being said, he's not necessarily inferior to any of them. He just simply is less flamboyant. In many ways, Caesar's dad reminds me not so much of Caesar as of Tokugawa Ieyasu, someone who was not the most outgoing or loud figure in the room, and someone who was often a little too cautious, but someone who rarely made mistakes. Someone who, in his caution, would only fight battles he knew he could win, and slowly but surely built up his power. Tokugawa nearly waited too long to seize power, but in the end things worked out and he founded a shogunate. I feel like Caesar's father was such a man. He just didn't happen to live long enough for his dreams to come true, which is kind of one of the flaws in being cautious. His son would not suffer from that flaw, as he was known for being very bold. That being said, in many ways, I think that father and son are a lot more alike than a lot of modern scholars give credit. A lot of people look for other influences and assume that Caesar the father was mired in mediocrity and that he was not cut from the same cloth as his son. In fact, I see quite a bit of Caesar the father in his son's actions later. Both of them could be calculating. Both of them could make rational decisions in ways that were often at odds with the norms of the people around them. But it has to be said that Caesar the son had a whole hell of a lot more flair and style. Partly it's because he had more natural heat, it seems like. He definitely had a bad temper, but he was really good at keeping it in check. My suspicion is that he was imitating his father, who was very cool, calm, and collected, but that he himself was not necessarily that by nature. So, in many ways, the core of who Caesar the dictator was, we can see in his father. But a lot of the elements that were needed to make him truly successful, he had to get from elsewhere. And Caesar the dictator would borrow quite a bit from all the men in his family, and from his family's many in-laws and allies. But in due time, I'll cover all those people, and we'll get to see all of the various contributions to the character of the dictator Gaius Julius Caesar. So I look forward to doing that with you. If you like what you saw here, like, comment, subscribe, and also check my link in the description below to find my Patreon and other things that you might need access to. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian, and I hope that you're all doing well. But, that you're still alive, unlike Caesar's dad, who, didn't quite get through with putting his shoes on.